start streaming on this, just because I have a tweet that's scheduled to go out that it's embedding the player, and I want it to be playing.
I also, every night, I'm
Okay.
like, tonight is a night I'm not going to drink. And then my child has a meltdown. I was like, nope, not tonight.
Yeah. Well, at least you start with the thought that you're going to stay sober,
Yeah.
because I go into 4 o'clock and I'm like, let's have a party.
Well, 7 o'clock here, so I mean, you're way overdue, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, we got people here.
Hey, everybody.
In.
Luke, you made it.
Hold on. Just tweaking a setting here. Okay. All right. People are coming in. People are flowing in. You know, one of the interesting things about this chapter was like I worked on the launch of Bing.
Oh. Okay, so maybe you can give us some perspective about
I mean, it was,
what it was like.
Utterly fascinating, and probably peak. Like, what I found interesting was reading about it in here and knowing that he was like kind of overseeing that group, but it was also like peak dysfunction.
Interesting.
You know,
I mean, I think it deserved its status as the butt of jokes, but it also ended up being a great opportunity for Microsoft. It worked out really well for them.
It worked out great. I mean, and I think it was the right thing to do. And it's funny. It's like the team building it was amazing. Like, I've never seen like a tighter group of engineers like turning out more impressive product faster. To be honest, it was everything else. It was the red tape. It was the like they integrated Facebook search into like Facebook Connect into Bing, like before like anybody else was thinking about like how do we implement or integrate the social graph into into search. It was just really fascinating to see firsthand. And but it was literally like to your point about like the ranking systems, stacking, right? Like there was like a full display. It was like you could not turn your back for a second because you'd be staring face to face with a knife.
Yeah. So wait, you're saying there was organizational dysfunction under Steve Ballmer at Microsoft?
Yes. Yes. It was like Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to share when we get there.
Ian, this is a great opportunity to talk about what you saw.
Some things were most of the stuff was very well documented, though. I mean, it's out there. It's out there in the open. Whether it was on the media side, the marketing side, the communications side. I mean, there was just a lot of things swirling around a very public launch of Bing. I mean, and it was, by the way, like a launch that that you had not seen Microsoft do around anything other than an Xbox launch, right? Like, remember they sponsored the LeBron James decision. I'm taking my talents to South Beach.
Oh yeah, they really have a very high batting average. Ian, but you have to give us a little bit more detail. You know, what type of backstabbing was there? Sorry.
Yeah, let's
now I get to ask.
Yeah, let's kick it off because I want Ian to be able to like kind of share his experience with everyone, right? Like, what was the launch of Bing?
So, well, and by the way, I was working on both the launch of Bing and the latest version of Windows Phone at the same time.
I see.
Oh yeah, that was a thing.
Yeah, and so both was. I think like in the Bing situation, it was just it was a very product-driven thing at Microsoft, right? Like, so clearly, like they couldn't compete on like just Bing it, right? Like that was not going to get people to switch over to Google just like.
Wait, was that the tagline?
Bing word. No.
Oh.
But it was like like
I wouldn't be surprised if it was.
No. The point of Bing that was like people want to say, yeah, just Bing it, right? Like Bing it, I'm gonna Bing it. Like no, like people are gonna Google everything still. So like, what are the interesting things that you could do? Like I worked on I remember we integrated I I think it's just an idea of how fast they moved. Like I had the idea, like you should integrate. This is like back when Foursquare was getting big. I'm like, you guys should integrate, Foursquare results and Foursquare data into Bing. And like, a couple of weeks later, it was done. And then like, Dennis Crowley and and Bing executives are on stage somewhere talking about it. It was really fascinating at how fast that division was able to move. But again, like how competitive it was internally to get the glory for making it successful. They had a huge budget, and that was part of the reason, right?
Was it
so like anything that gets a huge budget, right? That says like, all right, we got to go places that Google can't, like Hollywood, right? And so there were famous stories about being at Sundance that are very well documented, and like that was just not like it was. They did some things that just weren't kosher, right? And like then there was again, like the notion of integrating like Facebook into search, which was a great product idea, but poorly communicated to people and saying like, whoa, like, what does this mean? Like, are my search results all of a sudden informed by my Facebook behavior? And in which case, like, where's my privacy and all of that? Just a lot of things that weren't very thought through because it was so, again, like competitive internally. It's probably more competitive internally than it was externally because they saw their competition as Google. But in reality, they just needed like such a small percentage of market share, right, in order for that thing to work. And we saw it works. It works. I mean, it powers a lot of stuff inside of Microsoft, and and drives a significant amount of revenue. But yeah, man, like that was, I remember there was a 3-week period where I couldn't get somebody there to return my phone call while we were actively working on the business. So it was, again, I think that was just like a lot of like dysfunction, jockeying for position internally. And what I later learned was because it was going into one of those, stack ranking, areas. So, it's fascinating stories that I wish I could share in more detail. But regardless, like it was, I saw a lot of what was in this chapter, on display, and I think that the chart that you should, the drawing of the hierarchical.
Yeah, I can hold it up to the camera. Yeah,
I have it here too.
So Ian, do you want to describe what stack ranking is for everybody else on the call to so we can have like a base point for what that actually is and how it might change additional dynamics?
Yeah, so basically, don't ever do this at any organization you work at, by the way.
Here's the chart.
But it's like you basically have a bell curve.
The guns.
Right? You have a bell curve that you have to put that you have to rank or plot your team on, which means there's one spot for everybody, for each person, which means you have no choice but to rank people above others. And you can be a great performer. If you have a high performing team, you're maybe 10th best performer who's still like better than maybe another team's, or worse, your worst performer, which might be better than another team's best performer, is still going to get a crappy review, right? Or a crappy score. And that's what creates like kind of that Lord of the Flies mentality, which is like, if I'm not like kind of playing my politics right, like I might get an arbitrary score that can affect like my growth at this company, my salary, obviously like the future of my career, right? So it was, I think that like from an organizational dynamic standpoint, once I kind of really got an understanding of that, that kind of explained everything almost. And I think like if you could, like if there was one change to make at that organization that would have an effect that would make them close the removal of that, which I think Ballmer did on his way out.
He did. Yeah.
So,
all right.
Anyway.
So we kind of just got into it. Should we start from the top?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So this week we're talking about Microsoft. Ian and I were saying how we're very lucky we're not famous because there are not very unflattering pictures of us floating out on the internet. I mean, there might be, but not anything like that. So, this week it's really about, Microsoft as a case study because, they kind of went from being this poster child of like the deeply, deeply uncool to now, being one of the most valuable companies in the world. They kind of switch like between the top three, but it's really amazing to see their transformation. And, Alex was able to break that down on like how they were able to accomplish that. So we'll kind of kick it off there. I mean, going into this book, Can you kind of give us a peek behind the scenes of like the book writing process? Like, did you know that you were going to cover each one of these companies and that like Microsoft was going to be the case study, or did this come about a little more organically as you were doing, research and interviews on the book?
Yeah, I knew I was going to cover Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And I was sure I wasn't going to touch Microsoft because I thought Microsoft was boring. It was enterprise, the culture sucked, and it didn't belong in a book about leadership. And I think just like one of the things about the process of reporting is you need to leave yourself open to surprises. And the more I spoke to people about Microsoft, the more surprised I became. And it wasn't just the fact that since the book reporting began, the company grew in valuation in a big way. Its market cap sort of exploded over the last few years. To me, it was really learning about how the culture change took place. And I think that Satya Nadella had been out front. He wrote his own book called Hit Refresh, talking about how to lead with empathy. To me, I think that's important, but it really, wasn't exactly what I was trying to get at in my book, which was all about, how do you use technology to give people more time to come up with ideas? How do you build systems to get those ideas to go to decision makers? But then I started speaking with people about Microsoft because you really can't avoid a discussion about Microsoft. When you speak about the other four, people will just keep asking, what do you think about Satya? And I'm like, I don't really have a thesis about him. And they say, well, let me tell you something about him. And the more I learned about that organization, the more I realized that what he did was actually like a full case study of trying to lead and run a company with the systems that are discussed in the previous chapters. And so we initially had this other chapter. We were going to like do a chunk of Microsoft and do a chunk of Uber and Airbnb and like talk about how the systems that we discussed in the book apply to them. But all of a sudden it became clear that Microsoft deserved a chapter on its own. And unfortunately, I had already gone into Microsoft headquarters and like made a pitch to their PR team about, how they could like get a spot in the other chapter, and it was sort of determined on, how much access they'd give me. And I think they were insulted by that and ended up essentially shutting me out in the chapter. But I don't know. I just think that as you read through, you see that, a good deal of ex-Microsoft and current Microsoft employees spoke with me, and I was able to get the story, anyway. So, yeah, it's to me, it's a really fun chapter. There's so many wild stories in there that I never anticipated when I began writing the book. Whether that's the way that they used AI in their sales organization or their differentiating approaches to acquisitions from the Ballmer to the Satya days, to what I think is my favorite interview in the book, which is sitting down with Susan Athey, who used to be the chief economist under Ballmer, and now teaches at Stanford, and graciously welcomed me into her office and told me all about the decisions that Microsoft faced as it was thinking about whether to milk its asset in Windows or build for the future with cloud and mobile. So to me, I think that this chapter was a ton of fun to write. It's really when everything sort of clicked into place for me in terms of what Always Day One means when I started researching and writing it. And I hope it comes through in the text.
Yeah, and I think when we jumped right into it, Ian, you were sharing your experiences. I think it was when you founded Deep Focus, right? Like Microsoft was one of your clients, and was the Deep Focus years?
Well, it's funny. So actually, Microsoft was one of our early clients, but I was actually like back in the early 2000s, and we were working on actually just like through another company, actually, like just so I could get some money, to be honest, and we were actually working on selling to IT decision makers, ITDMs, as they would call it, right? And it's funny, like because you talk about this in the book, and how they were trying to basically sell what amounted to this book of CDs with software on it. It was servers and tools, right? And
nice,
which is amazing. And I was like working on this like in the early 2000s, so it was like completely relevant to me. But then I didn't work with Microsoft again until around 2009, 2010. And what was fascinating is I couldn't get a call back from what was then my biggest client. And just to give you an idea how dysfunctional it was, Microsoft in 2010 was going through a media agency review, which meant they were selecting agency holding company they were going to consolidate all of their online media spending with. And if you recall, they had bought a media they bought a company, a media technology company, and that went as a write down. But like
that's Aquantive?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the Avenue A Razorfish, right, which is part of it, right? So we actually had to step in because when they were going through the media review, the contract with one media buying agency ended. They hadn't gotten their act together to start their contract with whoever their choice was going to be for the new media buying agency. We were the only digital agency who could buy media on the Microsoft roster. So for about 3 months, this several 100-person agency in New York was buying all of Microsoft's global digital media, which was an interesting windfall, I guess, but just like shocked that could happen at such a huge organization. You're talking a Fortune, whatever, 3 organization, right? Like that we were buying all of their digital media, and it went kind of unreported. And frankly, I didn't want to draw attention to it either. But it was just really it felt like a house of cards over there. And I think kind of towards the end of, and it's what usually happens, I think, when there's a CEO, a path to a new CEO happening. But I mean, I don't know, that was in 2010.
So that was years before Ballmer left.
That was years before. Yeah. So, but it all adds up. And I guess in hindsight, maybe, that path was accelerating through that time period, but still it was just, again, and I take that back all the way through, which is what the theme of this book is culture, right? And in many ways, the culture is the people who work there, but it's also the guidelines and guardrails that you put around the people who work there. So yeah, it was just it was a weird time. That was a weird client. It worked out for us in the end, but still, it was just kind of a weird but fascinating time to be working on that business.
Yeah, and I was in the same camp as Alex, where I was I honestly don't know much about Microsoft, and that feels embarrassing now. But can you guys kind of describe the Ballmer years? You hear people reference it, but aside from examples like Ian, how would you describe it as his reign?
Yeah. There's a great article called Microsoft's Lost Decade by Kurt Eichenwald in Vanity Fair, which I quote from pretty extensively in the chapter. And it really describes how dysfunctional the place was and how it was a culture almost designed to kill ideas. And it was also just kind of interesting to see how people, in the tech world reacted to the culture at Microsoft without even being in it. I don't know, to me, one of my favorite stories in the whole book is from the beginning of this chapter where Aquantive, which is the advertising company that Ian mentions, gets acquired from Microsoft. And typically when you're getting acquired, you're pretty excited to go to a company with, more resources and make some cash. And one guy hears about the fact that Microsoft is the acquirer and he goes, "I'm not working for fucking Microsoft," and he quit the next day. And yeah, I think that, let me see, there's some really great quotes from Kurt's article where he basically talks about how the culture was, I think the stack ranking example is a good part of what was wrong with the company. It was cutthroat. It was loudest guy in the room, most often a guy. It was so anti, even looking at other technology outside of the company, that if you brought an Apple product in, you're going to get dirty looks and maybe a talking to from your manager. I mean, contrast that with Amazon and their invent and simplify leadership principle. They say, our job is to invent, and we appreciate stuff that's not invented here. At Microsoft, it was, if it's not built at Redmond, it doesn't matter. And the reason for this is because they were in this refinement culture, protecting the flagship product, which was Windows desktop operating system. And for some, there was a sense that the idea was just ride that Windows asset into the ground, and it's going to have some runway and you can make a ton of money from it. And the obligation to shareholders was to protect it at all costs. And when you have that sort of, it's cliche to say, but day two mentality, you're not going to be appreciative of ideas from other people. You're going to grind people down, and you're going to have fiefdoms. And I think that's a lot of what Ian was seeing from the outside, was just a total mess of a company struggling to do anything. And that's why it went from like one of the most feared companies in the world that required Congress to like, give it some serious antitrust treatment to a massive joke. It was the culture that caused it to crumble. And then, like Ian mentioned, it was a culture that caused it to build itself back.
One of the fascinating in that it could actually happen in this chapter is how you talk about how they failed to actually ask their customers what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They got so like accustomed to making things that people would use because you gave it to them that they just got so out of touch with who their customers were. And I mean, one thing that I remember in working with Microsoft was when they were going head to head with we were working on Office 365, and Google was out there selling Google like the G Suite to people, and they were directly competitive with one another. Office 365 was very heavy-handed. Like, this is like kind of your new way of using Microsoft products, right? Because that's how they thought. Like they would market the new version of what they already had with the assumption that everyone would just upgrade or subscribe or whatever it was. Whereas Google,
like Apple.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but right, because you were locked into the ecosystem. But they knew they had to sell to that IT decision maker, the CTOs, right? And they knew that the CTOs would have to, in some cases, make a case to their bosses. So their way of getting the CTOs to make a case to their bosses, the CEOs, was white papers, like white paper after white paper after white paper on how, kind of getting deeper into like Windows Server and Office 365, like all this would save a company money over the long term. Whereas Google, when they were doing this, they basically, if you have a question about Google products, they kind of give you the information. But then they have like a form that you could auto populate that is just literally a one pager that you could put on the CEO's desk to compel them to give like G Suite a try. Like Microsoft, like kind of doing all this research, doing all these white papers. Google is just like appealing to common sense, and Google made like significant inroads into that B2B marketplace in ways that Microsoft completely underestimated. And I think that was just an example of kind of understanding like the thought process that you're going through when evaluating products, rather than, again, like taking for granted that your customer is just going to re-up.
Yeah, and it's also a view of past versus future, right? Microsoft didn't like the idea of the future. It didn't like the idea of programs working on the web browser. So it didn't really care about Office 365, like the stuff on the browser, because it still wanted you to buy software in a box and install install Office on your Windows machine. And they knew that once they, started enabling this stuff on the browser, people might be able to use it on a Mac, or they might use it on a Chromebook. And so there wasn't this rush for them to start, building stuff that competed with G Suite, because there must have been like a view internally that as soon as G Suite works, Microsoft's kind of doomed, and they were going to win. They were going to win and lose on their turf. And actually, if you guys remember from the Google chapter, there's a moment that's incredibly indicative of the strategy of Microsoft at the time, where why did Google end up having to build its own browser? It's because Microsoft intentionally kept Internet Explorer slow, so the web programs wouldn't work well, so people would have to download and install Office. And I think we've talked a lot about how like this book is about strategy and culture, right? The big strategy, day one versus day two, culture. How do you build companies that reinvent? And it's amazing how under Ballmer, Microsoft was doing everything possible to do this stuff wrong. And it really cost it in the long run. And what's amazing is people looked at the Ballmer years and everyone was like, they're so profitable. He's a great leader. But the profits are just, they're a lagging indicator in terms of where you are in terms of inventiveness. And eventually it caught up with him, and it caught up with the company, and didn't work out very well for Microsoft until they reversed the culture and reversed the strategy.
It's fine. I don't know about this. Maybe you might, but there's a shocking number of write-downs that company had to make in those last few years of his tenure in the 2000s. Like, is there precedent for that, or is that completely normal out there?
I don't think that's there's a real precedent for it. I mean, they wrote down Nokia, Skype, and Aquaniv. I mean, two of those were $6+ billion acquisitions, totaling over 20. altogether. I think so. No, it's not usual. But again, this is culture. Like, why does M&A fail? Because of culture. Like, if you can't get a company to mesh with your company, it's going to fail. And the best way to make sure your acquisitions fail is to have a command and control culture, like Abdullah El Amiri talks about in the beginning of this chapter. And that's why Aquana failed. They didn't care what anybody at Aquana, had to say. And something amazing happened when Zaya took over. They approached acquisitions completely differently, where they made the LinkedIn CEO, when they acquired LinkedIn, they made the LinkedIn CEO, Jeff Weiner, in charge of the acquisition, in charge of the integration. So, and this is what Kevin Scott, the CTO of Microsoft, tells me. We're sitting at this diner in Silicon Valley where he goes, basically like, what this showed LinkedIn employees is that the person that they trusted, the person that had control over their fate, the person who set the strategy, is still going to be the one who their fate is in the hands of, versus some Microsoft bureaucrat. And that kept the LinkedIn employees engaged. It kept them happy. And ultimately, it's proven to be a very successful acquisition for Microsoft.
Well, it's funny. I tweeted today, actually, like, how often do you think about like LinkedIn being owned by Microsoft? And I think I made people real. I think people learned that LinkedIn, like Microsoft bought LinkedIn from that tweet. It's kind of, it's amazing, like interesting how, like, I know this is a phrase that kids use, but how low key that was. As for as big of an acquisition as it is.
I don't think kids say that anymore.
No, I don't know. I see. Maybe it's.
I was totally on the DL, homie.
Whatever, but still, it's. I see it on TikTok, but like how like you don't. It doesn't like it doesn't say like a Microsoft company under it, right?
Yeah.
Like under the logo, right. Like you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And maybe you could use a little like Microsoft mojo. I don't know. Like everyone's got an opinion on this stuff, but it's I think it is fascinating how having been in LinkedIn's offices, for example, like their New York headquarters, you wouldn't know either. There's nothing there. It's not like they have like Microsoft propaganda on the walls.
Yeah.
Not Instagram by Facebook sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you guys know the reason why Facebook needed to do that. It was because they are trying to get ahead of being seen as deceptive. And because no one knows that Instagram and WhatsApp are owned by Facebook, like the FTC might not have looked very kindly on that. So they just added the disclosure after they paid that $5 billion for doing other bad stuff.
Can we talk about antitrust actually a little bit? Because Microsoft, I mean, that actually happened to them, right?
Yeah.
But, in today's conversation about the big companies, when you've got, Google, obviously Alphabet, like having a whole host of companies and covering, like competition, like who your competitor is fuzzier than ever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like, how do you think Microsoft serves as a precedent for breaking, like, breaking up large companies? Versus how is that a cautionary tale? And do you think legislators today like think about that as they're considering, Facebook or Amazon or Google?
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the antitrust stuff with Microsoft that hurt the most was it got into their heads. And I think it made them uninventive. I mean, I think it partly contributed to the fact that their culture got stagnant. And I think you see that when these companies, are under the spotlight from regulators, the employees tend to feel bad about that. You don't want to be working at a company that the DOJ is cracking down on. But ultimately, I think today's regulatory bodies are not very strong at all. And they are opening, how many investigations have they opened up? How many actually seem like they're on the verge of doing anything? I would say a lot of investigations and very little action. And ultimately, and I've been like, on the book tour, I've been making the rounds saying like, we've heard from a lot of candidates about break up or shouldn't break up. And no one actually talks about funding the regulatory agencies so that they're actually on even footing with these companies and these companies can fear them. I don't think they're going to do anything unless they actually think that there's going to be some real repercussions. Like Facebook got away with a tap on the wrist, not even a slap on the wrist from the FTC for all the bullshit that it did. And Zuckerberg made a speech in front of the employees and then they did a press release on it. It's not, I don't know. I just think that like when you get slapped by a regulator, it shouldn't be something that you feel so good about that you broadcast, the footage of the meeting out to, the networks. So, ultimately it really depends on how this is done. But in terms of like the threat for it happening right now, it's very, very minimal.
And with Microsoft, it was Internet Explorer that triggered that, right? That was the straw, I think, that broke the camel's back, right?
Yeah.
If I recall. What's interesting I found is that, what 2 words I don't think were in the chapter that I was surprised at?
I'm sorry.
Or surprised by? Which is Bill Gates.
Oh, yeah, Bill Gates.
Who's kind of like, he's very present right now, right?
Yeah, he is.
We're there, we're there, and he got publicly dragged right throughout that, hubris wise, right? Like throughout that regulatory proceeding. I think there's a great documentary on it somewhere. But he's kind of emerged as a like kind of sage, wise person now out of he's kind of reclaimed the reputation, right? So he's not like kind of the richest man in the world who stole everybody's operating system anymore. Like he's like, completely washing himself clean by spending all of this money, which is great. But how much of is there any bit of that circulates that, that is any of that DNA still left, in Microsoft anywhere? Or is it just so long ago that it doesn't matter?
So I left Bill Gates out of the chapter to promote some mystique for my next book, which is called Plandemic. And it's about how Bill Gates invented the coronavirus so he could make money off of vaccines.
There's, by the way, you should go on Joe Rogan's show,
that's right.
Spotify. Only if you have Spotify.
Look, I'm not a sheep. Okay, I'm not gonna let billionaires dictate what I put in my body. It's okay. Actually, it's really interesting that you mentioned Bill Gates. I didn't even think about the fact that I don't mention him once in the chapter. I kind of think that his influence has sort of, totally fallen away inside Microsoft. Like, there's 2 people inside Microsoft that are relevant when you talk about leadership. One is Ballmer, 2 is Satya. It's interesting, right? Because it's like you would think there would be that longevity, that founder, inspiration like there is in Apple with Steve Jobs. I just don't think it exists inside Microsoft with Bill Gates. I think they've totally evolved into something new. And Bill and his his hot dance moves, in the Windows 95 launch are a distant memory for the most part.
I think the dance moves are lit, I think.
They were lit.
That's what the kids say.
Bill really can get it down. Listen, if you can be the richest man in the world to pay a bunch of people to sit in an arena and watch you jig across the stage.
I just think it's fascinating that there's no one asking what would Bill Gates do? Right? It's just everyone asks what would Steve Jobs do?
Right? He hasn't been deified to the degree that Steve Jobs has. And you could make the argument that it's what is it? You live long enough to be a villain sort of thing or fade away. Do they have an auditorium named after Bill Gates on Microsoft campus? Maybe a conference room.
It's possible. I didn't even get let into Microsoft campus. I just begged and begged. I was like, come on, let me take a walk through. And they're like, stay away. I don't know why they did that to me.
You exit through the gift shop, by the way, which is I find fascinating about
at Microsoft.
Yes.
Oh, what? The Windows logo is perfect for a lunchbox, so I would pick one up.
It's honestly, it's all Xbox and Seattle Sounder stuff.
Wait, they seriously have a gift shop? You exit through? I guess Apple has one. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. Hey, should we? Al has a question. Should we open it up?
It's Wednesday.
That's right. Hal, we were singing your praises before we went live. We appreciate the vigor you bring to this group. And
we're that guy's prep.
Say thank you.
Oh, we have to unmute him. Hold on one second. I'm sorry, Hal.
Yeah, Hal's to show our appreciation.
I'm trying to body language it. I'm doing what I can here. I'm doing can I do the hard thing?
Appreciate that. Hal, to show how much we appreciate you, we're going to keep you on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Silence is really what makes the hit song.
That's right. Yeah,
it's not the notes, it's the silence.
That's right. That's what this book is. Yeah, the book is all about listening.
And as the kids would say, the drop. Sorry, I'm out.
Exactly. So
references in the Ballmer picture, man.
Oh man. Yeah, that picture's for real. Oh my gosh. So I actually have I did want to ask about the honey bear, but that's not a real, just because I'm weirdly curious about it, because this is it seemed, I read that and I was like, oh my gosh, is that real? It seems like it could be real. It just seems so authentic that it couldn't be made up. But but anyway, and my other kind of question is I'm just curious as to why the milkers would just sort of stake their flag and we want to have people download this software. Because right now, if you tried to do that at any company, the same people, the milkers, would now be making the complete opposite argument, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah.
So I'd love your comments on both the milkers and the honey bear. I did not mean to make this food related.
Yeah. No, that's great. So let's start with the honey. So if any of you guys have seen the Steve Ballmer presentations to the entire Microsoft company, they're quite something, to put it mildly. They have lights and music, and he flails around on stage, jumping around. And I think there's one video where he actually just like pulls a hamstring and tries to, you hear him go, sorry, it's so funny. You hear him go, he goes, ow. And he keeps hopping around.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Keep your composure. Okay. Anyway, so Ballmer, he does this, and people are like, what's going on? Like, he's got all this energy. And so people inside Microsoft are convinced that he chugged a full honey bear before he went on stage. That was the rumor. People on YouTube are like, this dude's on cocaine. I actually brought that up on the Kara Swisher's podcast, and she goes, no, not him. Anyway, so there's the answer to the honey. You asked for it. And there it is. But notable that Satya converted the lights and music into a hackathon. And we've talked the whole set of sessions about how, the key to these companies' success is really appreciating ideas wherever they come from, making room for those ideas using technology. And what the hackathon showed was, instead of having someone talking at the company, they were interested in taking the ideas from anywhere in the company and raising them up. So you could be, any rank, any type of job, and then, you can get an opportunity in the hackathon to build something that Microsoft would actually use. Okay, your second question is, why were the asset milkers trying to milk that asset when the future now seems so obvious? This is a great question. So kind of like my favorite, part of this whole, of the whole Microsoft chapter, and a pretty interesting way to think about the book. So Microsoft had Windows. Windows was the dominant desktop operating system by far throughout most of its existence. And then, so that's the asset, right? And they knew that they could ride that asset for a while and make a ton of money. And then, maybe we would go to mobile. Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone, and Microsoft tried its hands at mobile devices. It never worked. And when you're on mobile, the desktop operating system doesn't matter very much. But like the other thing that they had was the thing. So mobile is one part of the future. The other part of the future is cloud. They never really got their act together on mobile. That one I don't understand. They tried, but they had a Windows focused culture. It didn't really work very well. The cloud example, though, is to me more interesting, because cloud and Windows are in direct opposition. And we talked a little bit about this with Office on the web versus Office installed. But when you build infrastructure for cloud computing, what you're doing is you're building the infrastructure for programming for people to use software on the web versus download the stuff. And when you're the desktop operating system of record with like a 90% market share, you want people downloading, because if people will start making software for Windows, people will use software for Windows, Windows becomes more valuable, rinse and repeat. The second you move to the browser, you can use the same program on a Windows machine or on an Apple machine or on a Chromebook. So all of a sudden it becomes this really existential discussion inside Microsoft, where it is, do we want to continue milking this asset? And hope that it's going to be a while because we're going to make the Windows experience better by, not enabling cloud and people will use this system for a while? Or do we want to build the infrastructure for cloud computing, which is going to make this key asset irrelevant, and we'll put like the thing that's brought us to the dance on par with Apple and on par with the Chromebook? And it's a very scary thing to say, what, our company has been built on Windows, we're going to hasten its decline, which is why they didn't for so long. But we talked a little bit about Bing. Bing is this cloud computing program on the internet that uses machine learning. It sorts through so many links on the web and makes decisions about what you should see. And you'd never download Bing. It's a search engine for the web. And Satya ended up working on Bing, after his time coming up through the company. When he saw that was going to be the future of computing, not the stuff you installed on desktop. So when Satya came in, all of a sudden it became obvious to him that the move was to start building the cloud infrastructure, because what you're seeing as obvious today was as obvious to him back then, as it is to us now. Where it wasn't inside Microsoft, it was something very scary. And that's when they make the transition and say, we're going to start building from the cloud, go back to day one, or as he says, hit refresh, and see if they can put themselves in position to get a bite of the future and let their present and past go by. And that's what they did. And it worked out incredibly well for them. So that battle between the asset milkers and the future staters was pretty intense and definitely not an easy decision to make, as you can tell by the fact that they waffled on it for years.
I think that's a good segue into James' question. So,
what's up, James?
I'll unmute him.
Okay. How's life up in there in orbit?
It's cold.
It's cold. Have you seen Elon's car?
Yes, it's still playing Space Oddity by David Bowie.
All right.
Not that you'd be able to hear that in space, not in vacuum, but
Man can dream.
Yeah, that's right. Look, it was a really interesting chapter because, it's been I've been sort of very big tech enthusiast. I was originally a Microsoft fanboy when I was much younger, and then I changed to Apple. As like a lot of people did. And now I'm seeing it's so interesting because now I go into all these meetings with startups and it used to all just be Apple MacBooks. And now you go into meetings and it's like Apple and Surfaces or Apple and like high-end, custom Windows PCs or Linux PCs. And so it's definitely feels like the company's changed a lot, and it was interesting to read it all. But I guess one of the questions I was really interested to know, and this is probably from like a broader like also just like good governance process, which is how did they end up choosing Satya as the CEO, given it was so toxic at that time? I would have thought they would have ended up going with someone else that was more politically favored. I don't know if you've got any sense of that, if you've got any stories from that. I'm just really intrigued to know that.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find this story in the book that I think is indicative of why they picked Satya. Let's see. It might take me a second. Here it is. Let's see. So let's see. So it's about, this is about Satya. After he gets named CEO, he goes around the company and listens. So I'm talking about this and I'm giving some context. So I say, from his early days at the company, he'd take young employees out for meals, simply to hear their thoughts on where the technology world was going. And so someone says, Satya would seek my opinion out. This is a former Microsoft employee who worked with him in the early 2000s, so a long time ago. And he goes, it was unthinkable that some senior executive would ask some random 23-year-old program manager, how is this startup doing? No other exec would give me the time of day. So I think that like it's pretty simple, but not something that was easy at Microsoft, that a lot of their senior execs never listened to anybody, never gave people the time of day because they would get up on the table and shout their ideas. Like, again, the loudest man in the room culture. But Satya definitely didn't embody that. Like, he was incredibly eager to hear people's point of view. And he's much like Sundar, right? A person that would minimize his, his personality and let people talk and hear him out and gather the best ideas. So I would say that's one reason why they picked him. And the other reason was because at the end of the day, he was already writing the future. So he went to this one division called Server and Tools, which I think I talk about a little bit in the chapter, which was, building support for companies that install, that want their programs installed on servers and used on the desktop. And he already began converting it to cloud when he was there. And that was also tough because that was a multi-billion-dollar business to build these servers. And the CIOs, like Athey says in the beginning of the chapter, they weren't so game to go cloud, because when you go cloud, individual departments can make their purchasing decisions because you make the purchase and then you just subscribe on the internet, versus having a CIO who's the typical buyer of enterprise technology, buy it all, work to set it up, feel important, and then become like an important C-suite executive. So it actually minimized the importance of the CIO. But Satya said, we're going to find some way to make it work for the CIOs so they can actually, do their work but move their companies into the future. And that's why you hear about a hybrid cloud, which means some of the programs are installed, some of the programs are on the internet. And that was a way to, ease companies into the world of cloud computing. And Satya was a big part of it. So I think he had the components of, what would make a good leader, and definitely didn't seem to contribute to the toxicity inside the culture in the way that a lot of the other executives who eventually got bounced, had become part of.
Cool.
I know we're talking a lot about Microsoft in a very favorable light right now. Is there a palpable sense of that people want to work there? That people aspire to work there in the same way that that they might aspire to at as any of the other like very big companies, or has the tide turned to companies that are a little more like who are fast risers, like a UiPath, for example?
Yeah. Hal wants to say something. I'd love to hear Hal's perspective. I'll just say quickly, I did this tweet last night that got a lot of people yelling at me, but it was talking about what all the tech giants lack. And I'm just going to read it. We've gotten to the read the tweet stage of the book club. I feel pretty good about that. So what did it say? So I said, oh yeah. And then Hal commented on it, which was funny. Okay. So what the tech giants lack. So Facebook lacks shame. Amazon lacks empathy. Google lacks selling skills. Apple lacks inventiveness, and Microsoft lacks sex appeal. So I don't think that Microsoft is a hot place to work. In fact, like when people go to Microsoft from companies like Amazon, which I talked about in an earlier chapter, people wish them well in their retirement. And actually, it was funny to see a bunch of Microsoft employees chime in on that tweet, where they looked at all the other companies and they're like, "Yep, we'll take it."
Right.
But they are the most valuable of all the tech giants right now, and there's certainly an appeal to that for people trying to go work there. So I don't think they have the same appeal as the others, but it's certainly a lot better than it used to be. Hal?
Yeah, I was just going to add my 2 cents, and obviously this is one perspective, but I'm an MBA student at Indiana University. That's what I'm doing at Indiana. And I went to a job fair late last year, before COVID, before everything. And there were a bunch of companies there, including Apple, Google, and Microsoft. And I'll tell you what, the line from Microsoft was ridiculous. I stood in that line for 2 hours, and it was an 8-hour job fair.
Wow.
And then I had a conversation, and the conversation lasted about 30 seconds. And then that was it. That was it. That was it. I mean, I also talked with Apple and Google. Apple, I went straight there. Their line got crazy, but I went straight there in the beginning, and that was interesting. But and then Google kind of had this more open place. You could sort of walk up and talk more easily. In a weird way, the booths of these 3 companies match very, very closely to what you wrote about in the book.
Interesting.
Because Google's was like open, like 3 walls open. You just like go in and out and like, hey, what's up? Welcome to Google. And everyone's milling about. Microsoft, there's like 4 lines. They're broken out by like your specialty, whatever you want to work on. Like your and then you get in your line and you just wait till you get through. And then Apple, you sort of walk up and there's this sort of tucked in the back. And there's like this big Apple sign. And there's like these nice tables. And, you punch in some stuff on an iPad and then like, you wait, you hold your hands like this in front of you and wait your turn. And then you get like,
Yeah, one of those.
But you're actually at an Apple store, Hal?
I mean, it was about as close as you could get to Apple Store in like a in a job kind of experience.
So they sit you down and they say, "So Hal, what seems to be the matter?"
Exactly. Yeah. Like, welcome.
Hal, your tweet.
Like do the TP.
Yeah, Hal, you reacted to my tweet. There goes my selling Microsoft socks outside the nightclub business plan. I'd like to see you present your business plan at next week's meeting about this. I think it has some legs.
Yeah, look, I mean, I had it all written up. But then I read your tweet and it just said Microsoft lacks sex appeal. And I was just like, well.
You threw it into the river in the middle of campus.
We're done.
So we'll short Microsoft socks.
Yeah, short the socks.
Short the socks.
PowerPoint roulette on one of our next sessions. Everybody bring a deck.
Bring a deck, that's right. We'll have a good time. Ben, you've worked at a few of the companies. Would you ever work for Microsoft?
No, but that said, like I used to do a lot of tutoring for kind of college and high school kids, and I remember a couple of years ago, like all of a sudden they wanted to work at Microsoft. I don't know if it's like Xbox related or something, but they definitely saw the company in a positive light.
Yeah, cool.
And I think Ben, you had a question, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Quick question. I guess when I think Microsoft, I think enterprise company. Like that's kind of what they've been, and that's kind of their main customer base as well, I think. So I'm wondering. I mean, except for Xbox again, like that's sort of their consumer focus. But it's like a part of me thinks their phone strategy didn't work because it would have to be more consumer focused. Sorry, let me refresh my question. So I guess, does it affect the fact that they rely so much on enterprise partners and customers that, Nadella's culture shift has kind of impacted any of that?
Yeah. Well, I think that their success is definitely, a good part of it has to do with focus. Focus has helped. But their enterprise relationships is also why they've been able to really build so quickly and become so valuable again. So, I would say that the people who've built their cloud system are enterprise customers they've been calling on for years. And when you have a relationship with an enterprise sales rep who says, "Hey, are you interested in this cloud offering?" and you already have an account open with them, versus Amazon, which may or may not call you but has been the leader, you're probably much more inclined to go with that enterprise sales rep and, have a company you trust lead that transformation for you. So I think the fact that Microsoft has really doubled down on enterprise and has been working on enterprise for a long time has really helped them in terms of their ability to turn Azure into, a powerhouse business from basically zero. So I think, you hit on it perfectly. Like, it definitely matters a lot.
Can I chime in on that a little bit as well? Just because, through my work, it's evaluating a lot of new partners, right? And so when you work for a large company, it's much easier to have your existing sales rep, like to your point, Alex, come up to you and say like, "Hey, we've got this feature set, you can buy extra to like activate it." It might not be the best in the industry, but if you think about the alternative, which is, a new company where you have to go through like IT global security, cloud compliance, like get the relevant stakeholders, go through contract negotiations. Like ultimately, if you're like, "Hey, Microsoft, like good enough, let's try that." Yeah. And so even just signing up new partners, it's like when you have big players like Microsoft, Salesforce, all those guys, it's just, it's honestly like the path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm. So do you work with Microsoft, and what's your experience been like with them working?
Yeah, so we are, we do have Microsoft. We work on Teams and stuff. I mean, I honestly don't speak to that group very often. I'm kind of more on the Salesforce side in terms of, engaging with our various partners. So I'm more of like Facebook, Google, Pinterest, like those platform partners. And then our IT team interfaces with Microsoft more. So, but we did make the switch to Teams recently, and, I think it's pretty good. Although we were on Skype. So, I mean, the bar was pretty low.
Yeah, I used Teams for the first time today. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
It's a nice product.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, it doesn't have like that. I really like that Slack reaction of the multicolored parrot, like going like this. So that's like what I'm missing from Teams. But if they had that, I mean, I feel like
I know.
Similar.
Microsoft should pull a Facebook and just copy it.
Oh, probably.
Oh man, the stories that just popped around that over the last 24 hours. I want to get to Sonia's question as well, and I think it's kind of a disturbing trend a little bit, right? And so in the last week, I can't remember if we talked about it in this club or not, but it's like Google kind of, excuse me, kind of undercutting its own like diversity and inclusion efforts in favor of working with outside contractors to come in and manage those for them, mostly as what could be perceived as a response or an uprising by not the folks for diversity and inclusion, but almost like the anti-diversity and inclusion people saying, okay, it's not our problem anymore. We've hired somebody else to address this for us. Let's see how they do.
Yeah.
Now you've got, Microsoft here who, has had issues in the past, certainly in just, helping or ensuring that there are female leaders rising to the top. It's not often that you hear about like strong, visible female leaders at that company. And it seems like that's continued through the Nadella era. So I'm wondering, if I guess Professor Athey had any more to say about it that didn't make it into the book, or if that, came up voluntarily or involuntarily from people that you were talking with.
Yeah. And Sonia, do you have anything you want to add to that also, or?
Yeah, I was actually
sorry. I tried to unmute you and it wasn't working. Sorry.
That's okay, no problem. Thank you. I was actually surprised by that because I, in the Bill Gates days, knew women that worked for Microsoft and felt like there was a lot of championing of women at that time. So, so I was just curious if you did have a chance to talk to the professor about it and what her take was, and just more about what you heard about it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get a chance to speak with Professor Athey about it. We had like a pretty quick meeting, and I mean, the download of information was fast. But yeah, there were employees that would, but yeah, actually probably should follow up with her and ask what her experience was like. She obviously had a very prominent place inside the organization, but as we know, it doesn't mean much, right? Like, we'll see if she had a positive or negative experience, unfortunately. I would say that I was surprised to hear what I heard about Microsoft. I mean, I did have this one, let's see. Yeah. So this one former employee told me that people had come forward and told me that others that an engineering colleague had made racist comments, sexist comments, and is a bully. When I called it out in his performance review, I got told the guy is too valuable to the company. He knows so much in a field that very few people understand, and that it would just be super hard for us to lose someone like that. And I'm just like, holy shit. And that was disturbing to hear, honestly. I don't think it's a crisis at Microsoft, but I do really think that there's this old boys type of culture that they have there that they haven't fully fixed. I don't have much positive things to say about that. It's really unfortunate.
I
don't mean to be a downer, but
yeah. I don't necessarily think that's like a Microsoft specific thing though.
Yeah.
Like I can see that conversation happening in any of the companies that we've covered. And when you look at Google and they're like golden parachutes for like guys who behave badly, like I'm sure that same conversation went on there. And to James' point too, James in space, it's like brilliant jerks, right?
Yeah.
Like you're I mean, and that's like That's a question you sometimes get. It's like, do you want someone who's extremely smart but an asshole, or do you want like a kind, like, idiot, right? And so I do think that like that brilliant jerk, like it's a stereotype that holds, and I think it's still something that hasn't been resolved today, right?
Yeah, no, I agree, and you're right, Orchid. It is something that you could see in any company, so it's not like a Microsoft only thing. I guess we know as reporters, if we make enough calls, we'll probably find, a bad story anywhere. But yeah, what was interesting about this one was it was just sort of proactively shared with me. And then that there was a chain email inside Microsoft about, people talking about the bad things that had happened to them there.
Yeah.
I mean, that can't stand. So.
All right, let's take it home.
Yeah. So next. So I've been trying to like keep pace in that, like going like chapter by chapter each week. It's sometimes very hard to do because this is actually like really like good reading, and I just want to keep going. So it's been some willpower. But the title of the next chapter has me very intrigued. So a look into the Black Mirror. I mean, I think dystopia is all the rage these days. So I'm curious, like, kind of what's the best thing to preview for those of us, who haven't read that chapter yet?
So for next week, when I made the schedule, just bundled the Black Mirror and the conclusion chapter. I can preview it, but before I have an idea, and maybe this is, maybe you guys aren't interested in it, but it might be fun to like do like Black Mirror and the conclusion next week, and then sort of have like a reunion show where, people can sort of bring their thoughts and any
like
leftover questions.
Totally.
Yeah. And definitely, if you guys are interested in doing that, because, Black Mirror, I don't know if there's, we can talk about it. Actually, no, there is a lot to talk about. What am I saying? So I'll just talk about the chapter. So I think that there's a problem in the tech world today where we don't have enough pessimists and people who are dystopian thinkers. And I think you'll recall from the Amazon chapter, there's an Amazon executive who says like writing the 6-pager is like writing science fiction, except for the fact that, they have a fake press release in there talking about how well their product did. They don't really allow for unhappy endings. And there are plenty of unhappy endings in technology. And I think that anyone who's read, a few articles in tech news knows that's the case. So for me, like this was a way to make the case that we need more dark thinkers. So what I did was brought a award-winning science fiction writer and someone who started the Arab Spring in Egypt over to my house for dinner. We hung out in this room, and I just described the technology that exists in the book and said, let's come up with some episode descriptions of what would Black Mirror look like if it sort of took the technology discussed in this book to its most dystopian ends. And so we have that, and then like a few real world scenarios in there, which talks a little bit about, like what the problems with the tech giants and things like that. And it's kind of unfortunate, but it talks about there's a section in there that talks about meaning and how our society is struggling with meaning. And we get meaning from like 3 places, mostly. We get it from our friends and family, religious institutions, and from work. And friends and family and religious institutions have crumbled recently. Like it's interesting, like the most connected generation, but also like the most seemingly lonely in terms of like relationships. And then like the work to me was like the one thing that was holding us together, like, holding the meaning puzzle together. And I talked about like what would happen if there was like a mass unemployment event due to automation, but we're going through a mass job elimination event due to coronavirus, and I'm nervous about what that's gonna do. So we can talk about that, and like maybe everyone can like think about like where you get meaning from and how your perspective on that has changed. Although who knows, maybe the coronavirus will make friends and family and religion stronger. I don't know. And then the conclusion just talks about the leader of the future, what I think the leader of the future is going to look like. And so I think I mentioned in the past, but I studied labor relations at Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Ezra was there, who's on the call today. Yeah. And so for the last chapter, I had learned all these new things about leadership in Silicon Valley and like the way that I think the work world is going, the way I think leadership is going. So I got on a bus and went back to Cornell campus in upstate New York and visited the school and said, okay, everybody, it's been a decade since we've talked. Have you paid attention to these changes the way I have, and where do you think things are going? And so it should make for a fun discussion, I think, in terms of like what as a leader is an interesting term. What does it mean to be a leader? What do the best leaders do, and where is it going? Moving forward, so we can have that talk and then do a reunion show.
So Alex, so you want next week to be Black Mirror and Leader of the Future, is that right? And then we'll do the reunion kind of recap.
Sure.
Okay.
What do you think?
Right, cool.
Yeah,
we can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm super curious, and we talked about this a little bit last time in terms of like the leaders that are transforming or responsible for the cultures of these organizations. Like, I kind of want to know if it's nature versus nurture.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's cool.
Hoping it's nurture, because nature, I'm old enough where like, it's gonna show up by now if it's there. But no, thank you so much, everyone. We will see you next week. But otherwise, stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alex, of course.
All right. This was great. Luke, glad you made it.